English secondary education major at Endicott College. And for the last 2.5 years, she's been writing a book about the men and women of Reading and North Reading who were in World War II. And over the past 2.5 years, she's found quite a bit of information that she wanted to share with us. So I think it's going to be a very, very interesting topic.
Let's shut some. Turn your mic on, and you can grab it.
And we'll set the light up.
All right, I think this is on. Everyone can hear me all right?
That's fine.
All right, awesome. So, as was said, I'm Autumn Hendrickson. I'm currently a junior at Endicott College up in Beverly, Massachusetts. I've been studying English with a focus in secondary education. I'm intending to become a high school or middle school English teacher, although many people would call me crazy for saying I'd rather teach middle school. So, either you're crazy if you want to teach middle school, or you're very, very sad all the time and disappointed all the time. That's what people tell me, apparently. I don't know if it's true. But yeah, so for the past 2.5 years, I've been researching the men and women from Reading and North Reading that served in World War II, and it was something of an oddity for me to kind of become so incredibly just immersed in this world that was so far removed from my own. I, having been born in 2001, a little bit over a month after 9/11, I'm like a baby. Like, I really haven't, I mean, 9/11 is literally history to me. And it's something that I would say all of you have probably lived through. So that's, I mean, that I think is something in and of itself. Why would I care about something like this and then care about it so much? Well, I always loved history, and I always loved genealogy. And that's kind of how I got into military history. I found out, to my great surprise, that my second great uncle had been killed at the Battle of Montserrat in the First World War. He was a Canadian. He was in the cavalry. His body simply went missing. And that was kind of how I got into military history, because I realized, I was like, wow, my uncle died in this war and I know nothing about it. I should know something about this war. And so I did my best to learn as much as I could about World War I, and I mean, at heart, I'm still a World War I buff. But I had no real connection to World War II. I was adopted, and my adoptive family is actually my only connection to World War II, and I no longer live with my adoptive family, and I haven't since I was 10, although I still keep in touch with them. I moved back to Massachusetts, where I had been born, to return to live with my former foster mothers, who are sitting up in the front row, and the lovely home that they gave me in Reading was really what I think helped my love of history and my interest in genealogy meet with my love of Reading, which they gave me. And that's where I spent from 10 years old to 18 on West Street in Reading. And for me, I always wanted to have a connection to World War II, because I still have this very vivid memory. I took World War II European theater in high school at RMHS, and this girl in my class one day brought in this bag to class. I was like, hey, Mr. Dent, this was my uncle's, this is sand from Omaha Beach and stuff. And all of us were like, what? Well, okay. And you know, the way that kids would talk about it, oh, my grandpa, or oh, you know, my great uncle, or so-and-so, and I just kind of had to sit there. I had no connection to it. Not a single person, like, related to me by blood within my, like, nuclear family or my direct line served in World War II. They didn't. My family bled mostly in the First World War. So, all of a sudden, at the end of my senior year, right as COVID hit, I got offered a job to write for the Reading Post. And I was like, great, but There's nothing to write about. Everyone's in their houses. There's a pandemic. The world is changing. And so I had to find something. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be cool to take people back in time? Maybe. I didn't think I would find anything. But I was like, well, this is literally my job now. So I have to look. So, and I've told this story so many times. I sat up in my bed with a box of goldfish and Ken Burns' documentary, The War, and I looked through draft cards that were sorted for Reading. And the first one I opened was of Frederick John Estes Jr., who lived, I believe, on Bancroft Street in Reading. And on the top, in red ink, all caps, it said, deceased. He was killed. He was one of Reading's 24 guys to be killed. And that was the first card I found. So I was hooked right there, because it became very clear to me very quickly that if I had been born when they were, that very well could have been my next door neighbor. So without further ado, we'll get into things here. I'm going to give you guys a slice of some of the many individuals I've uncovered. I've been researching over 500 people. All except for 4 are dead, which means that a lot of the research I do is archival research. Very rarely am I able to have the good fortune of being in touch with relatives. So it really is, this is how I know these people. Through the newspapers, through what records tell me about them, through what I can find about the units they served in. So, I'll talk first a little bit about our guys from the Navy. These are just a handful, but I wanted to find some guys, especially guys from North Reading. And then of course I had to throw in Francis John, or Fran Thornton Jr. in there, because his story is just truly magnificent and amazing. But I'm gonna, and this will just kind of follow, I'll speak about each of these individuals and maybe speak a little generally, and we'll move along. And if you guys have any questions that are directly relevant to the slide, feel free to raise your hand, and if I can get to you, I will. Otherwise, you can hold till the end, and not only will we hopefully have time for that, but I'll hang around afterwards. So if there are questions you really want to ask me, I will be here. So Harry Wilbur Nutter Jr. was kind of, I guess, a black sheep in the Navy, because he wasn't in the Navy, he was in the Marines. But as many of you might know, every ship, pretty much, had a Marine detachment on board. This served a lot of different purposes. I mean, first and foremost, it was tradition. But secondly, the Marines were theoretically there to protect the ship if the ship were ever to come under direct assault while it was docked. They were infantry, right? They were there for that purpose. They also had a variety of different skills that the Navy guys had but were using in other ways. So Harry Nutter, for example, was an assistant to admirals. He was one of the flag boys, so he would kind of stand outside the office on board whatever ship he was on. So he was often transferred to flagships of fleets. So if you think about, just like every army has a general, every Navy has an admiral, but the admiral is usually on the flagship. So the flagship is selected from a fleet of, say, 10 destroyers and a few cruisers. One of the cruisers is going to be the flagship, probably. And so that would be where Harry would be, because he would follow the admiral around. Now, Harry was, he joined the Marines before we joined the war. I think he could smell the blood in the water, like a lot of these other young men and women. And Harry was actually aboard the USS Indianapolis as a member of the Marine Detachment when Pearl Harbor was struck. He was very lucky. He was not on the USS Indianapolis for long, which means, for those of you that are familiar with the story of the wreck of the USS Indianapolis, he was fortunate to escape that. He did not have to suffer the fate that many of those men did. But the USS Indianapolis's story is very interesting because it was one of the few ships that was actually at sea when Pearl Harbor was attacked. And you can see in the deck logs of the ship, all of a sudden around noon on December 7th, it says in all caps, intercepted message, Pearl Harbor. Pearl has been attacked. This is not a drill. I mean, for many of these guys, that's where they were when the war started. They were literally in the field of action. They were at sea. They were part of the first response force that was going to go and attack the Japanese fleet. They were told to search around Johnston Atoll. That's where the intelligence had suggested the Japanese fleet was directly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And the truth is they were there, they just weren't there very long. The Indianapolis made way to Johnston Atoll, found nothing. Along the way, they made contact with a submarine. And you have to understand, I mean, these guys are going from peacetime to wartime. There's no real transition for them. They're at sea. It's not like they get to come into port and process what's going on and go back. They have to go from peacetime, this is probably a drill, to this isn't a drill, we could be dead. And so when they made contact with the submarine, they started dropping depth charges like it was nobody's business, and they weren't hitting anything. They were terrified, they were scared. They were getting their sea legs in a very real way. And additionally, the USS Indianapolis happened to be carrying civilian passengers. They were destined for the Philippines when Pearl Harbor happened. So what do you think they did to all the civilians? They mustered them out on the deck and assigned them to gun crews. Because the ship was not fully manned. And so all of a sudden you had like civilian photographers, government workers, being taught by a 21-year-old sailor who barely knows how to run his own gun mount, how to run a gun mount. It wasn't a great situation. They were very fortunate to not be attacked. They did have a few aerial contacts. They saw planes, but then the Navy made the decision to send them back into Pearl to kind of regroup and gather more ammunition and offload those civilian passengers, because that's not a situation you want. You do not want to have civilians on board in a situation like that. And of course, you can see the newspaper cutout there. Mr. and Mrs. Harry W. Nutter of Borough Road, North Reading, have received word that their son, Harry W. Nutter Jr., is safe. That's all you need to hear as a parent. All you want to hear, he's safe, he's okay. He had actually been planning to visit Richard Cobb and his wife. Mr. Cobb was a very well-known aviator in Reading. And in fact, he was even featured in a Reading yearbook in all his flight gear. He was one of those boys who, I think the first time he saw a plane fly, he was like, I want to be there. And that was him. And in a very sad twist of fate, Mr. Cobb did not even see out 1942. He died in a plane crash in Australia. And so this was the last time that someone from Reading probably saw him. A very sad thing. And then you have Francis John Thornton Jr. was the first Pearl Harbor survivor who I uncovered in my research. And so for that reason, he holds a very special place in my heart. He served aboard the USS San Francisco, which was in Pearl Harbor when Pearl Harbor was bombed. And at the time that Pearl Harbor was bombed, unfortunately for him, his ship did not have any of their armaments or their boilers. The ship was being overhauled, which meant they were literally sitting ducks. They were like a glorified paperweight in water. And as I'm sure some of you are familiar with this idea that, I can't remember who they say said it, I don't know if he actually said it, but that an admiral said once, the Japanese gave us a great victory on Pearl Harbor because they bombed us on a Sunday. Most of the men were not on their ships. They were on shore leave on Sunday. Francis was not, and we know that because there was a first-hand account published in the Reading Chronicle from Arthur Doucette, who was aboard the USS Pyro, who said that he looked across the decks of the ships in the row that the San Francisco was in and saw none other than Tex Thornton manning an AA gun. So he was likely one of the men from the San Francisco that ran over to the USS New Orleans, which was docked right next to the San Francisco, and did have her guns. Not all of them, but she did have her 50 cal machine guns. Not quite AA guns, but we'll give Arthur a pass there. And so he likely was one of those men who went from the San Francisco crew to go help the New Orleans defend herself. The USS San Francisco would go on to see some of the heaviest fighting in the early months of the war. Is anyone here familiar with the Battle of Savo Sound or Iron Bottom Sound? I'm seeing a few head nods, a lot of shakes. So when the Allies invaded the island of Guadalcanal, Guadalcanal was invaded by the Marines, the 1st Marine Division. August 7th, 1942 was the first ground action taken by the United States forces in the Second World War. It was the first time we didn't retreat, we invaded. Guadalcanal is a tiny little island in the Pacific, and the Marines came in on August 7th with the Navy in tow, right? Someone had to bring them there. And then the Navy left because it got almost completely annihilated. The Japanese Navy was very good at night attacks, something that few navies in the world at that time could claim to be good at. They even had special torpedoes that they could program and use at night without a problem. There were not any sighting issues. The Japanese fleet snuck up on the American fleet. And at first, the Americans thought they were friendly ships, and they didn't fire. And then they saw them firing at them, and they started firing. And the next morning, well, to take it back a little bit, the Marines were on Guadalcanal, and they saw it happening. They were seeing all these flames, bursts of flame. They were hearing the sounds of like thunder. I mean, these are like metal gods, like battleships, 16-inch guns. This is massive. And for many of those Marines, they would report, it wasn't until that moment that they realized just how effed they were. If that thing turned its guns on them, they were gone. And they were sitting there in their foxholes cheering, just hoping that it was the U.S. that was winning. And the next morning, sailors with our uniforms were washing up on the sands. Pieces of our ships were coming up on the beach. And they realized we had lost. The San Francisco was there that night. The San Francisco was there again, one of the few ships to escape that carnage. The ship actually got hit by a kamikaze, kind of, from an explosion from a kamikaze that tried to come in. Took out one of the entire gun mounts, killed 12 guys instantly. And this young man, who was like 21 at the time, witnessed the whole thing. And when he came home, this is something that when I saw it in the paper, it was I wasn't surprised, but I was saddened. He was one of the first guys to come home from like action, right? Especially one of the first Navy guys, and a lot of people in town tried to like talk to him about it. And there was like a headline that said, "He won't talk about it, but he's been working hard." You can try, and like that's what I said, you can try to talk to him for another week. He'll be going back in a week, but he won't tell you anything. Of course he wouldn't. Why would he? I mean, the things he had seen, he probably was still trying to process. Fran would go on and he would actually serve one war patrol on a submarine right at the end of the war, the USS Capitaine. It wasn't a war patrol of note, but I think it's really amazing to think that this guy saw so many things and was like, I'll volunteer for the submarine service. But he did, and he went. And then up in the corner, up there, unfortunately I don't have a photo of John Charles Lake. I wish I did, especially because he is North Reading's only sailor to be wounded in action. Mr. Lake was, as you can see, a very young man. He was born in 1925. He joined the Navy when he was about 17 years old, with his parents' permission, I hope. And he served aboard the USS Lucy, which was a destroyer, and that's a photo of it underneath. And the USS Lucy, you know, I mean, it had a not very notable career. That's not to say it didn't do anything. It participated in the invasion of the Philippines in the fall of 1944, although it did not join that effort until May of 1945. But John Charles Lake had the misfortune of being wounded when his ship was hit by a kamikaze plane off of Okinawa. I believe it was on May 4th, I want to say, 1945. And he was one of many men wounded. I believe at least 20 men from the crew were killed immediately. And he was picked up by a nearby ship. They were very lucky that they got picked up. But unfortunately, they got picked up by landing craft, which was very difficult for many of the men who were really seriously wounded because they had to climb over the side of the landing craft. And so many men who were really badly wounded drowned because they could not get them out. The sailors who were pulling them out of the water too were exhausted by that time as well. So John, as was tradition and protocol, was given survivor's leave, which is a type of leave given to any sailor who survives the sinking of his ship. So he was lucky enough to come home after this incident, and he did not have to go back. But I mean, I think it would be a lie to say that probably, like, oh, that definitely didn't impact him, even though he didn't have to go back, and the service of his ship outside of that event was not particularly intense. You know, your ship sinking is pretty intense. So that's Mr. Lake. Wesley Harold Steber, who's on the bottom in the corner over there, that's a picture of him. I should say the Steber boys, that was a family from North Reading. All of their sons served. Wesley was just the one Steber boy I chose to include here. I could have included all of them. But Wesley was a sailor with the USS LST 344, which was a landing ship tank, which basically meant it was one of those big ships that had a flat bottom, which meant it was really not fun to be on in high seas because it would just bop around like a cork. It had no real keel under the water to ground it. The whole point of them was so that they could drive up onto a beach, lower their ramp, and troops, vehicles, whatever, could come out. So, of course, that puts him right at the front of every invasion. And of course, Mr. Steber did participate in like every invasion. He was at Sicily, he was in the mainland invasion of Italy, and he was at Normandy. He was very lucky as well. His ship had, for whatever reason, and I've read many war diaries of landing ship tanks, for some reason, all of the German planes seemed to love his ship, because I have never seen a ship get attacked by planes more. And also, they were so lucky they never actually got damaged. They got strafed a ton. They took a lot of casualties as a result of that, but the ship itself was okay, was never seriously damaged, and he lived to tell the tale, obviously. But USS LST-344 did land on Omaha Beach on D-Day and made, I think, 12 round trips in the course of 3 days from the beach to England and back again. They transported a lot of wounded, including German wounded who were captured. And then he was lucky, he got relief a little bit, because after the invasion ended and then we were really pushing across France in like the fall of 1944, luckily for him, his ship was just assigned supply runs back and forth from England to France. It was no major undertaking, although I'm sure if you asked him and the stevedores who were lifting all the equipment, they would disagree with me, and right they are. So this slide covers the ground war in Europe. I want to point one guy out really quickly if I can. I'm going to put the microphone here. It has always been my belief that this man right here in this picture is Kenneth Clyde Bushway. Kenneth served in the company that this is a picture of, and was there. He would have been there, and I always say, he's not named in the picture, I'm sure it's him. Mr. Bushway was from Reading and was pulled off the line shortly after this picture would have been taken because he had a wound in his thigh that got very badly infected. But anyway, these other men here, so there's Richard Joseph Beaumont, who was from a set of brothers. He had a brother, Robert. Richard served with the 60th Infantry Regiment of the 9th Infantry Division, I believe Company E or F, I can't remember off the top of my head. But the 9th Infantry Division was a very, very, very combat familiar division during the Second World War. The 60th Infantry Regiment had landed in North Africa when we first took our first steps onto enemy soil in the European theater. November of 1942. Richard was not with them at that time. He joined sometime in August 1944, right as the Allies were starting to kind of find their footing in France and slowly nudge the Germans back past Paris. He was wounded, I believe twice, shrapnel one time, and I think shrapnel both times. Mr. Beaumont, one of the things that I think is so lovely about him is that in his obituary, there were notes left by 3 different families who said, the Beaumont name was very well known in our household. He and my dad were great buddies during the war. So clearly, the friends he made in foxholes stayed with him. And he was also very involved in the 9th Infantry Division Association. He would frequently send in letters searching for different buddies that he had made during the war. So this was definitely an outlet for him, that kind of brotherhood that he found in associations like that after the war. And then there's William Harris Crosby, who, once again, I'm so sad I don't have a picture of him. William Harris Crosby is misidentified in the famous photo of Ike talking to the paratroopers before the invasion. Some of you might be familiar with that photo. Sometimes, for some reason, he is misidentified as one of the men in that front circle around Ike. He's not there. It wasn't of the company he was in, but you know, it's cool. William Harris Crosby served with Company B of of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. William is also pretty much, well, he's North Reading's only paratrooper for sure, and he's one of 2 paratroopers from Reading and North Reading that survived the war and served with their unit beginning in Normandy all the way to the end. There's only one other man who can say he did that. William is one of them. William was unlucky, pretty unlucky. He was wounded very severely in the leg, in his left leg. I believe, I want to say it was June the 8th of 1944. It was a very infamous incident involving his company, in which his company commander had told the men to start pushing across a field towards the next hedgerow. They did. They got there, and they realized that there was an angle through the hedgerow. There was a German tank looking right in on them, and annihilated a lot of the company. There were 11 men killed from his company on the day he was wounded. He was lucky. He was very lucky. William had the ability to recover, and he was given that gift of going back to his unit, and he got to reunite with all of the men that made it through the Normandy campaign. He jumped into Market Garden in the Netherlands on September 17th of 1944, the very ill-fated Operation Market Garden, in which the men were told, "Oh, you'll only be fighting Hitler Youth and old men," and they were SS troops. It was a horrible defeat, and it was also the campaign in which one of Reading's other paratroopers was killed. So William went on, though. He kept it up. He made it through the siege of Bastogne, which many of you probably are somewhat familiar with, when during the Battle of the Bulge, as the German army speared into the side of the American lines, they focused very heavily on seizing the small Belgian village of Bastogne, where the roads, there were 2 major roads that met there. And the 101st Airborne somehow, some way, in the coldest winter that region had seen in over 50 years, held on to Bastogne. And William was there. And he's from your town. Up there, Richard Joseph Campbell. Again, unfortunately, I don't have a photo of him. I wish I did. Richard Joseph Campbell is the only ranger from Reading or North Reading. When I found him, I was starting to think I'd never find a ranger from the area, but he was with Company A of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, which for those of you, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the story of Pointe du Hoc, or Pointe du Hoc, as a lot of Americans call it. He was not actually assigned to scale the cliffs that day. He was assigned to go in with the 116th Infantry Regiment in the first wave on Omaha Beach. He was backing those guys up. He wasn't going up the cliff. And in fact, Richard is one of 2 men from Reading or North Reading that landed in the first wave on Omaha Beach on D-Day. There were only 2 of them from this community, and he was one of them. Richard likely witnessed a lot of death that day. As I'm sure many of you are familiar, it was like a shooting gallery. Over 1,000 Americans were killed on that beach that day. He was luckily not one of them. He did manage to get himself shot, as all Rangers do. I would give them the right to, given the way the Rangers were used in World War II. They were basically used to solve any problem that the infantry couldn't. And they did a pretty good job of it. I mean, he would have fought at Hill 100, which is a rather infamous hill in Germany that was seized by the Rangers of his battalion. in December of 1944, and he finally, it's interesting, the story conflicts. He reported that he had been shot by a German machine pistol in the hand. He did not say who was holding the German machine pistol, and the morning reports say it was a non-battle casualty. So that would imply either he accidentally shot himself or someone else shot him. But he was okay. He made it home. Unfortunately, and this is one of the stories that is, it's hard to tell. Of course, you can see Richard's date of death, October 19th, 1957. Well, Mr. Campbell was dishonorably discharged from the United States Army in 1953 as an undesirable. That very year, many gay men were discharged from the United States Army as undesirables. That's not to say he was gay. It certainly doesn't say he wasn't. But for whatever reason, the Army decided that a man who stormed Omaha Beach in the first wave and sustained a wound in the line of duty was undesirable. I can't help but wonder if the shame or embarrassment or depression he felt contributed to his rather young death. In the bottom corner is a photo of Albert Stefanian. For some of you guys, I don't really know if these families still are around in the Reading area today, but there was a lot of Armenians that came to the Reading area. Albert Stefanian's family was one of them. Mr. Stefanian served with the 2nd Armored Division in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy, and in Normandy. Of course, as you can see, missing soldiers still writing to his family. Mr. Stefanian was reported missing, erroneously, it would seem, in July of 1943, shortly after the invasion of Sicily. But he was still writing to his parents. So his parents got a telegram saying that he had gone missing, and less than 10 minutes later, got a letter from him, dated the same day, and then a week later got a letter after, and they were like, "What's going on? He's writing to us, he must be okay." And sure enough, a few weeks later, the Army apologized and said, "Oh, we're sorry, your son was definitely not missing, he was okay." Of course, in a unit like the 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels as they were called, of course he could not make it through the whole war without being wounded. He was, his kneecap was completely shattered by a bullet in August of 1944. He did not go back to his unit, obviously, following that. Since he died in 2010 and I've not been able to make contact with any members of his family, I don't know how that impacted the rest of his life, but I'm sure it did. You don't just recover from your kneecap just completely coming apart, no matter how young you are. The war in the air. This is kind of a shorter slide, but unfortunately North Reading, for some reason, did not have many flyers. I'm not sure why, but Horace Herbert Jones Jr. is one of them, and I will point out which one he is in a second. Right there. There he is. So, Mr. Jones was a sneaky guy. He enlisted at the age of 17, which you weren't really supposed to do in the Army. You were allowed to do it in the Navy and the Marines, but you weren't really supposed to do it in the Army. So either a recruiter was like, "Just say you're 18," or he lied, and the recruiter believed him. He became a pilot, but then he kind of decided that wasn't his thing, and so he switched over and he was a bombardier and navigator aboard, I believe it was mostly B-17s. He did fly every now and then on B-24. He was a member of the 390th Bombardment Group. He started flying missions in the aftermath of the 8th Air Force's Big Week, which was flown in like February, I want to say, or January of 1944, in which the Allies bombed Germany day and night over and over and over again. He was a replacement. to come in and fill in for the massive casualties that any campaign like that creates. Mr. Jones also did fly a mission on D-Day. He was one of the boys who bombed the beaches to try to create foxholes and hiding places for the men who were going to come in after him, which pairs up very nicely with Mr. Gunn, Chester P. Gunn, whose story is amazing. So both of these men actually completed their tours, and they both flew 33 missions. I just thought that was funny. They both did. Chester was a pilot. He was from Reading, and he flew his first mission on D-Day. Can you imagine flying your very first mission on D-Day of all days? He flew 33 missions, and this guy, I don't know why, he decided, I really like this. I want to go do this in the Pacific. So he volunteered for another tour, and he served with an emergency rescue squadron in the Pacific. Their job, they mostly flew old, completely ripped out B-17s. They would drop rescue boats, rubber boats down for crews that had been downed, and they would go and send back the position and rescue them. He participated in 9 rescues before the war ended. So the ground war in the Pacific. So the ground war in the Pacific, yeah. These are 3 guys, 3 amazing men. Michael Mentis, by far, one of the most interesting stories I've ever discovered. So Mr. Mentis was a Marine, and for any prior service people in here, or anyone who knows about World War II medals especially, you might find it very odd when I tell you that Mr. Mentis received the Soldier's Medal. He was a Marine, not a soldier, so why did he receive the Soldier's Medal, Autumn? Well, that was exactly what I was asking myself, trying to figure out. Mr. Mentis was a member of the intelligence section of the 5th Marine Regiment. He had enlisted in 1940. Is anyone in this room familiar with the Gotage Patrol? No? Okay. So the Gotage Patrol took place on Guadalcanal shortly after the Allies landed. This was back in August 1942. This is the first time we ever met the Japanese in battle. We didn't know how they would fight yet. We were still feeling them out. And early in that campaign, the 5th Marine Regiment selected their best men from the intelligence section because they had captured a POW who had said that his unit was starving, that they would probably surrender, their will to fight was starting to break. And so the Marines, for some reason, and I still don't know why, I'm sure they, looking back on it now, don't know why either, they decided to send their entire intelligence section to go find these Japanese soldiers who supposedly wanted to surrender. Mr. Mentis was the lucky one who didn't get picked, because every single man on that patrol was not just killed, but mutilated. When they found the bodies of these men, they found their genitals in their mouths. It was horrific. It was really the baptism of the Marines. There was no question after that what kind of enemy we were fighting. And Mr. Mentis had the great fortune of not being picked for that mission. And because of that, he would go on to be selected for a very top secret mission to reconnoiter New Britain. The Allies wanted to invade New Britain, and we did invade New Britain in late 1943. He was there long before anyone else was. He went in, likely with a bunch of Australians, some Marine Corps officers. It was a small group, 7 men, to reconnoiter all the Japanese positions. And someone, I still get mad about this on his behalf. I'm sure it really pissed him off too. someone decided, well, the intelligence guys just did their job so well that they never were engaged in combat, so we can't give them a silver star, because a silver star is only for someone who's been in combat, as if they weren't in a combat zone the entire time. So they decided, well, we'll give them soldiers' medals. That's not a knock on the Soldier's Medal. The Soldier's Medal is truly an extraordinary award. I mean, it's given to somebody who goes above and beyond to save someone's life outside of combat. When the risk isn't there, you know, like, they still take that initiative. And there were other men from town. There was a man, James Thibault, who tried to save a man drowning in a river. One of his buddies during training. He got the Soldier's Medal. So that's the type of thing that you get the Soldier's Medal for. I mean, you run through a fire, you pull someone out. Not reconnoitering an island is one of 7 men on the island that are friendly. Mr. Mentis also was Reading's only known, I say known because that's important here, only known Marine combat fatigue casualty. Mr. Mentis, after fighting through the Pacific, received a concussion from a blast that went off next to him on the island of Peleliu in the fall of 1944, and he was pulled off the line on September 17th, 1944, and they diagnosed him with a severe blast concussion and combat fatigue. He never saw combat again. And lucky for him, that meant that he got to go home, and he met his wife at Camp Lejeune. She was also a Marine, and they got married, and I think it's really funny that on their marriage certificate it lists her address as Hut 50,702, you know, like Camp Lejeune, and they lived happily ever after. Charles William Berglund Jr.
I knew Mike, and I told Ginny, your father must have known him very well.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So,
And Mrs. Menton came
he's
in
a local
also.
neighbor of ours, and we knew him throughout most of his life. And the other thing I point out, notice his address.
Upton Street?
No,
Yeah,
it's now Cedar Street.
Cedar
Yeah,
Street.
it was
Okay.
known then
Like
as
back then
Upton
it was
Street.
called Upton
Yeah,
Street.
I always take down
Yeah.
what's on the draft card, but I'll have to add it in
That's because it's 2
parentheses.
streets next to each other, Upton Ave and Upton Street,
Yeah.
and it just confused them all.
Ah, all
Well,
right.
of course, the Mentis family,
Yeah.
Johnny and, you know,
And John.
His
they
brother,
were-
yeah.
Yeah, they ran a big farm on Upton Street. Very well-known family, so
Yeah.
it was kind of nice to hear about him.
Yeah, no, of course. And I'm glad to hear that people
Yeah.
know him because he's such an inspiration to me. So Charles William Berglund Jr. was another one of the many men who was a brother pair. You'll get to see a picture of his brother at the end of the slide. Charles was an original member of the 81st Infantry Division, a division that pretty much no one talks about because everyone thinks that only the Marines fought in the Pacific. Newsflash, that's not true. Every single Marine Corps operation in the Pacific had Army backup, even Iwo Jima. There was the 147th Infantry Regiment fought on Iwo Jima. That was a U.S. Army division, or regiment. So, Charles William Berglund Jr. was a member of the K Company, 321st Infantry Regiment, 81st Infantry Division. He fought in Angkor, I think is how you would say it. He supported the landings in Peleliu, Saipan. Sorry, not Peleliu, Saipan. They captured a few other small islands. You know, and I feel bad saying that because I'm sure those were very significant experiences for him. There's just so many of them that I can't remember them all. He also fought in the Philippines. Unfortunately, I'm still waiting to get additional information on his regiment. So I unfortunately don't know a lot more than that, but trust that I'll find out. And then Roger Ernest Wilson is from Chestnut Street. He's something of an anomaly. He served in Company C of the 127th Infantry Regiment, 32nd Infantry Division. The 32nd Infantry Division has the claim to having the most days in combat during World War II. Why have I never heard of them then? Because they fought in the Pacific. They met the enemy in battle in New Guinea, and they fought mostly in New Guinea. Very few US Army units fought in New Guinea. The ones that fought in the Pacific did not fight there, except for this division and the 112th Cavalry Regiment. Those were the only two units of any real size that fought in New Guinea. Luckily for Roger, he did not join them until February 1945. And when he did join them, as you can see, trapped 3 days in a foxhole. That was his introduction to combat. His company got surrounded and pushed back down a hill, and he was stuck in a foxhole, and at night, his buddies would crawl up and give food to him and come back. He eventually, in April of 1945, he sustained burns from white phosphorus. White phosphorus I don't want to say that it wasn't used as a chemical weapon. That wasn't really its primary purpose, but the Army saw, that makes people burn. Okay, that works. Because it was what we used to make smoke. A lot of smoke grenades used white phosphorus. Not all of them by any means, but a lot of them. So I don't know if it was simply a matter of him accidentally walking into his own smoke grenade, if something went off in his pocket, I don't know. But it was very severe wounds. It was all on his buttock and his thigh, all the way down his leg. He was a fighter though. He went back to his unit. He finished out the war with the 32nd. And this is one of my favorite slides. They asked me to put it in. I wasn't going to include many of the women because unfortunately I don't have many pictures of them. And as is so often the case for minority groups, there's just not a lot of information about what many of these women did. And in the same way that it's hard to find out what a man did in a stateside unit, it's just as hard to find out what a woman did in a stateside unit. But Myrtle Thorpe Harris is one of the first women I found when I was doing research. She is I love that picture of her. To me, when I first saw that, I was like, I would not want to cross her. She was a Navy officer. She outranked her big brother. I always love telling people that, because I'm sure he was very upset about it. She was a nurse, and she was stationed temporarily in Australia, and then she was assigned to the USS Benevolence, which was a hospital ship. It was one of 3, and also the first, hospital ship into Japan after the surrender of the Japanese. And she wrote truly moving letters. Her ship was one of the ships that welcomed the many POWs who had been held by the Japanese for years at that point. She said they were nothing but skin and bones. And she said, when these men saw her, these were the first Americans they had seen in years. Some of them didn't even realize that they were free. And she said it was just heartbreaking. But at the same time, it was so special. She would write home, and then the letters made it into the paper that she had never felt so important in her life, and she never would again. That's what she said. That for her, this experience was just life-changing. She was the first contact for many of these young men with America, with home. And she also remarked, and I thought this was funny, she said, I've never been wined and dined more in my life. All of the nurses on this ship, all the POWs are coming up to us, and they're like, oh, you look nice, would you like to have, my dinner with me, so she said, I had so many, hospital rooms to go visit and eat dinner that I was I couldn't eat anymore, out of the goodness of her heart, and for all the nurses, just giving these men a sense of home, letting them know what had been going on, and just being there. So Irene Norton, I know the text is very small, but I think she's a great way to highlight to all of you the struggles of researching women, because the caption spells her last name wrong. It's insane to me. I think it's partially because when women get married, we change our names a lot. So that is one of the hardest parts, but I mean also just the inattention to detail. A lot of the times with the men, I can see like there are guys who have very long like Polish last names and they're never spelled wrong in the records. Somehow they could misspell Norton, and they did it over and over and over again. They would just swap between them. It was wild, but there she is coming home. I think she's in the front, in the middle. Unfortunately, I don't know a whole lot about Miss Norton. She served with 2 different hospital units overseas. That's unfortunately all I can tell you about her. Luckily, there's a lot I can tell you about Doris Ward. Doris Ward was, when I found her, I think I cried because it was just so amazing. She was one of the first WWII officers, Women's Army Corps. She was one of the first ones. She had been living in Illinois for a while, and she actually worked as a social worker. For a long time, she helped place orphaned children with foster families. And she joined WWII, and she became kind of an activist. She was actually interviewed, and I wish to this day that the film existed, or if it did, that I knew where it was. She was supposedly interviewed for a film the Army produced on women in the Army, and she spoke out about all the struggles that she faced as a woman in the Army. She was a strong voice. She was always in the newspaper, not always for good reasons. She pissed people off. Go ahead.
Question. Is that her birth date? So she was 40-something
Yes.
when she went in?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, she was, well, and in that same way, I think that's part of the reason why she was so comfortable making people mad. I mean, she had been alive for a while. She knew her way around. She knew how to deal with the men who were bothering her, the men who were making her life so difficult. And so she didn't have a problem with it anymore. She had the age to back it up. She certainly had the rank to back it up. She was an officer. And she didn't put up with it. She was always in the newspaper everywhere she was. She was stationed a lot of different places, and she would always go to the paper and say like, hey, I want to raise awareness about the issues that we're facing in the women's quarters on base. Like I do recall there was one particular mention in a base paper that she was trying to get men to donate money so that the women could buy menstrual products, because they had nothing to take care of their periods. Like nothing, and the Army wasn't giving them anything, and the Army wasn't letting them clean any of the things that they would use because, oh, it's got a woman's blood on it. It can't go in our laundry. Oh. And so, so she was like, no, yeah, that's not okay. We're not going to do this if you can't even let us take care of our own bodies. Yeah, she was ahead of her time. She was a Spitfire, so an amazing woman.
Who is that she's saluting there?
Oh, so that is the base commander. So whenever a WWII unit was stationed on a base, they would get to know that whoever the woman in charge of all the women, and she was always that woman, they would meet the base commander, and they would, get to know each other, because even though they're separate branches, really, they're working for the same goal. And so they would often have they would try to have good working relationships. So she was kind of the liaison between those women saying, we need menstrual products, or we want our own bathrooms because we're scared to go to the bathroom, which was another thing she raised awareness about. She would be telling him that. That was that relationship. So this slide, of course, is by default the saddest, but I guess in a lucky way, North Reading, for all the men and women that North Reading sent to a very big war, only 2 of them didn't come back. However, Frederick Clark is the youngest man from Reading or North Reading to be killed in action during the Second World War. He was 18 years old and 8 months when he was killed. He was drafted when he was 18 years and 6 months. Took 2 months, a 2-month turnaround for him. He His parents were separated as well. They were estranged from one another. No idea why, but they were. His father lived in Newton, and his mother tried to stay in Reading, and then she just couldn't. I think she probably couldn't afford the home anymore. I think that's probably what happened. But she was devastated by his death. She actually wrote to the Boston Globe begging anyone from his unit to please write to her. She wanted to know what happened to her baby. He was killed in action on April 26, 1945, less than a month before the Second World War would end. He was serving with Company A, 11th Tank Battalion, 10th Armored Division. And I think in many ways, and I obviously don't know for sure, but I imagine he was probably one of the stupid rookies. He was a replacement, and when you're in a tank, there's very little room for error. A lot of the more experienced tankers did not like working with rookies, with green replacements. And the sad thing about being a replacement in a tank is that if you screw up, the other tankers, I mean, their self-preservation is going to get them out of that tank. They might try to help you, but if they think you're too far gone, they're going to leave you because they know they'll get themselves killed. There's a story that's always hit me hard of Don Howard, who moved to Reading after the war. He crawled away from his tank as it burned. He knew full well that the driver was still in there. And when he realized, he said, well, I'm just going to get shot because the other guys are running. I'm crawling. He went back. He was going to die. He had decided he was going to die with his friend in the tank because he knew he couldn't get away. So I imagine with Frederick Clark, it may have been something similar where they all were able to get away and they just kind of prayed, please, please, please get out, kid whose name I don't know. Because they probably didn't know his name. They probably didn't know who he was. They probably barely knew his face. He was a replacement. And he died. He was brought home. His remains were returned to North Reading. I believe he's buried in Riverside Cemetery. I don't know if his mother ever heard from anyone in his unit, but I do know that his death most definitely shook that family, and I'm sure shook this community. Lewis Titcomb, as you can see on the other side, he died at the very beginning, really, of the war. Lewis enlisted, again, like so many others, smelling the blood in the water. He enlisted in the Army Air Corps in December of 1940. He was a member of a ground crew unit. He was sent to the Philippines. And of course, on December 8th, 1941, the Philippines were invaded by the Japanese. And there he was with his training on how to operate a plane's armaments. And they started, throwing rifles into his hands and telling him to fight like an infantryman. Not much is known, unfortunately, about the kind of makeshift infantry units that were put together because pretty much all of them were annihilated. So no one really knows what they did. Lewis was captured by the Japanese, likely in April of 1942. He died of dysentery at 3 p.m. in the afternoon on July 27, 1942. The only reason why we know his time of death is because his buddies wrote it on a wrapper for a can of beans. It's in his individual deceased personnel file. You can see the other side of it says canned beans. They kept it, and somehow they held on to it through the war. And so that little piece of him remains with his name in the handwriting of the man who wrote it down, the time of death, cause of death, and his address, 24 Elm Street, North Reading. Lewis's mother was so hopeful, like so many others. She was so hopeful that her son had lived through Bataan. In fact, she went to an event where one of the officers, high-ranking officers who had escaped Bataan, was speaking to ask him, "Have you seen my son? Did you see Lewis?" Of course, he didn't know. She said in the Boston Globe, Mother's Day was coming up at that time. She's saying, I hope on Mother's Day I hear from him. Of course, she never did. Lewis's remains, thankfully, were identified. Of the other men from Reading who died in Bataan, he's the only one whose remains were identified. And so he is actually properly memorialized. So this brings me to my last slide. These are pictures of Robert Oscar Berglund, 4th Infantry Division, Stanley Prescott Steber, Americal Division, Oakesdale Road, North Reading. And then over there is very small Elwood Lyndon Richardson Jr., Robert Edwin Turner, Francis Martin Hayward. I love that picture of Livia Edward. She was actually Livia Steber. That was her married name, Edward. And she was Rosie the Riveter, North Reading's very own. Lloyd Ralph Hay, John Francis Steber, and just some pictures of some of the things that their divisions did. So if anyone has any questions, anything they'd like to know about me, about the project, if any of you have any relatives who served in World War II and lived at any point in time in Reading or North Reading, whether it was before the war, after, I'd love to hear about it. So yeah, I mean, go ahead. If anyone have any questions, anything at all? No? Go ahead.
I was going to ask you, are you focusing almost entirely on active combatants? Because I was thinking of all the people that served in the war and lived here, but were not in the active military per se. I mean, I was thinking that obviously both North Reading and Reading had aircraft. Air raid wardens.
Yes, the air raid wardens.
Because it was a genuine threat, and of course the theory was that Britain was not going to last.
Mm-hmm.
It was Britain would the Luftwaffe was so aggressive that Britain would just be forced into surrender, and then
they'd come to us.
The plan was that they were going to come to us, but they were going to come to us by way of Iceland.
Yes.
And that for example, my mother's brother, who was from Worcester, as a young lieutenant, was assigned to a anti-aircraft battery in Iceland.
Yeah.
Never saw any action, but it was a real threat that the Germans would defeat Britain, take Iceland, and use Iceland as a jumping off place to bomb the United States.
Yeah.
And then people like my father's cousin, who was up in Maine and was an elderly lady who loved bird watching, was out there on the coast of Maine with her little bird glasses and a guidebook that showed all the German aircraft and how to recognize the German aircraft. But it is interesting, the stories about the non-combatants.
Of course.
Or people like my father, who was a structural civil engineer, and they would not allow him to be drafted because he was busy working as a young engineer with B.B. Badgers in Boston, and they were designing oil refineries. And not only were they designing oil refineries for the United States, but they were designing oil refineries for our great ally, Mother Russia.
Yeah. No, that's great, and no, you're completely right. One of the things that I unfortunately have found is that the only way to really find those amazing stories is from the relatives of the people who are still alive. Because just like how the women who served stateside and the men who served stateside, their stories are kind of lost because they served stateside. That's kind of what happens with those people too. There are some fantastic stories. There's this one woman, I just love her. She was a clerk at, I think it was Sanford Mill in Reading, and She wrote thousands of letters to all of the men who went overseas, and when they came back, they didn't hold a party for themselves, they held a party for her. And they literally, like, she was the party. And there were plenty of women in Reading who also hosted any service members who were coming through. I do have some funny stories about, there's one man who I spoke with who, he was a little boy in Reading growing up, and he told me this really funny story. His mother hated having to turn all the lights down because they didn't have really good blackout curtains. They just didn't have the money. And so she hated just having to shut the whole house down whenever the sun went down. And one time she was like, gosh dang it, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. And so sure enough, knock, 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 ma'am, you need to turn off your lights. And his mom was just like, no, I'm not, I'm going crazy. You know, she just couldn't stand it. She was done, and they're like, Mom, just do it. It's okay, really, Mom. But you guys will keep me up all night, you know, because they would run around and play. If it was dark out, they would go outside and play, and it would, you know, make her just as nervous. You know, what are they doing? I can't see them. So we promised, Mom, we won't go outside. We won't go outside. They did. They did go outside. But no, I mean, yeah, those are just amazing stories. And I often, sometimes when I write, I have to do what I call kind of historical guessing. I can make some guesses about the mother of the man who was falsely reported as killed in action, you know, having interactions with mothers whose sons were killed. And, you know, like, I can kind of make those guesses as to what that may have been like, and I can make educated assumptions. I mean, obviously the B-17 that crashed in North Reading, there are a lot of stories that I've heard about that. I mean, I also have some lovely stories of, like, men who, it's one of the sweetest things watching, like, an 80-year-old man become a little boy in front of me as he tells me about seeing the B-17s that flew over Reading on their way to New Hampshire, like, a few times. They would just look up and be like, oh my God, you know, like, it was, you know, so there are some awesome stories from the home front, and also stories from guys who were not necessarily in combat. It's one thing that I really want to try to highlight as the men who were in combat zones but didn't actually ever fire their gun, because their jobs were just as important. It takes an army to move a single infantryman forward. That's why there's an army. That's why less than like 2% of frontline troops were actually infantry. Most of them were not infantry. Most people who served in World War II were never anywhere near the enemy. They fought their battle with supply lines, and with pipes, and with trucks, and so they were mechanics, they were quartermasters. It's hard to tell those stories, but I definitely am trying to make sure I do them justice. So, anything else? Anyone else?
Might be a little bit off, but if you were a prisoner of war in Germany, were you treated any differently by the Germans if you were a Jew?
Oh, so that's a great question. I believe it varied. My understanding was that there were a handful of Americans that were in Auschwitz that were captured and discovered as Jews. Also, a few Brits. There was a small unit of them in Auschwitz. So they certainly cared, but I think after a certain point they realized that they were so overwhelmed with their own very genocidal, horrific ideas about how to handle Jewish people that they realized they couldn't possibly also accommodate all the POWs. Many of the camps that were supposed to be concentration camps were turned into POW camps. One thing that I think is important to know is that if you were a Russian Jew, 100%. We were almost certainly treated differently, because the Russian POWs in general were treated much worse by the Germans than Americans. If you happened to be a Russian Jew, you were sent off to a concentration camp. There is one story of a man from Reading, Harold Seymour Roberts, who I have every reason to believe was a Jew. He was captured by the Germans in early 1944. He was an air corpsman. And I often tell people this story. It's horrific, but he was moved around Stalag Luft 7, Stalag Luft 7B, and he was death marched. And the camp that was accepting the overflow, because as the Russians advanced into Germany, they started having to evacuate the POWs because they didn't want the Russians to liberate all their POWs. And so the overflow, one of the overflow areas was Wobelin concentration camp. And that's where Harold Seymour Roberts, a Jew, spent the last 3 days of his captivity in a concentration camp. I can't imagine. I feel like if there was ever any question in his head of what he was fighting for, if he was still, why am I still alive? That answered it.
On our dog tag, it always had the blood type and the
Yeah,
religion.
a lot of them would
And a lot of them just got
drop
rid of
them. Yeah,
rid of their dog tags. They
Bury
didn't want
them.
to know they were Jews.
yeah.
Very good. Very impressive, young lady.
All right, I think this is,